Welcome to well, let's try that again. Welcome to Matt's Book Corner, and so this one is going to be actually a little more of a topic than talking about a particular book, but this is going to be talking about the value of reading just in itself, and there is quite a value, I think, to reading, or value of reading. In my life, really a lot of the big aha moments have been with books, and that's not to say that you wouldn't have those aha moments elsewhere. For example, I had a really big aha moment with Jim Fetzer's presentation, False Flags on Five Fronts. That was a huge aha moment, and that sort of helped divert me towards more of the truther territory. Not that I hadn't been kind of truthery already. One of the books that I've read in full has been the David Icke book, Remember Who You Are, Remember Where You Come From, or whatever the full title is for that one. And that's the only David Icke book I've read in full, but it was a good one. And I remember going into Barnes & Noble and getting it after hearing about David Icke, and I was like, oh shit, they actually have a David Icke book in here. They usually have one or two. That may be a signal. But nevertheless, David Icke, he has tended... I've talked about this before. I don't know if I have released it or if I will, but David Icke has tended to steer you in a better direction than not. So in terms of the people you can listen to, some of them can steer you in a good direction, some not so good. Someone like Scott Adams has a lot of helpful stuff. He has some powerful books, including what I've read of his new one, actually, Reframe Your Brain. Pretty freaking powerful. It sounds kind of generic, but pretty damn good stuff from what I've looked at it. I have the ebook version. If I had the physical copy, I'd probably have looked at it more. Actually, I may end up getting the physical copy. I'd like to get that. I guess I'll get the hardcover. I have listened to some audiobooks recently. Listening to audiobooks is not the same as reading, but nevertheless, you can get decent stuff out of them. But it's not the same. Quite literally, it's not the same. When somebody says, I read a book, and it turned out they just listened to the audiobook, it's like, well, you didn't read the book, and I'll tell you how I know, because you don't have to know how to read to listen to an audiobook. So therefore, if you can do something without actually having the prerequisites for doing that activity, and in actuality you're not doing that activity because you're not reading, you're listening, then that's a good hint as to you're not actually doing it. But nevertheless, Scott Adams has some good stuff, very good stuff, but he's also very much, not only does he come off, not only does he sort of toot the normie horn, but he toots the normie horn in a way where it seems like he might be doing it facetiously. Like some of the stuff about, let's just say, the medical stuff, I'm not so sure Scott Adams really believes what he's saying. Maybe he does. I don't know. It's not like he's some guy who has come down in any way as hard in favor of the medical stuff as a lot of other people. But nevertheless, he floats topics in a way where he says things, he talks about things in a very logical way, but sometimes the logic can obscure things. So, like, there was I think maybe I think the last episode I listened to any part of his, and maybe the last one I will listen to a part of, because I realized how dangerous it was to be listening to him. Not, like, I do mean that too. It's like, oh, Matt, censorship. It's like, no, it's more if you listen to somebody speak for hours and hours and it's a very persuasive person, then, you might I had a little aha moment that I was sort of being led back into the mainstream narrative, sort of a Cypher moment from The Matrix. The moment Cypher, he said, well, I'd like to just go back into the Matrix. It's just more fun to be in the fake reality, and I just don't want to remember any of this, and and that's about it. So I felt myself getting lured back into like the whole politics stuff, even the thing like Scott Adams was talking about. He was like, well, here's the thing. He often will say things that are very logical, and in some ways it can be very helpful. Like he'll break through conditioning by pointing out sort of little breaking points in the logic of something. So he said something about like how there was a guy who was some kind of like official at a pharmaceutical company, and he had said something about all the pharmaceutical companies sort of doing the same thing in response to a certain perceived other thing. And he was saying how, I think he was saying something like how unlikely it is that they would all do the same exact thing, and how that's like evidence of some kind of malpractice. Now, here's the thing. I'd probably be more amenable to what that guy was saying, but I've gone so far into trutherism that it's more of a Matt McKinley wavelength, where Matt McKinley on Quantum of Conscience on YouTube, where it's like, well, it seems like these people are sort of put up there. It seems like these people are kind of controlled opposition. So, I don't know, maybe this guy is, maybe he's not. In the David Icke sense, I would say it's probably better to listen to him than to listen to certain other viewpoints and go along with them, and go along with certain medical things maybe. But what Scott Adams' response was, and it was a very logical response, what his response was something like, well, what if all of these companies, like representatives from these pharmaceutical companies, went to the same conferences and stuff, and so they were sharing sort of the same wealth of information, or sort of the same way of perceiving things, or at least they were looking at similar propaganda maybe about like advances and this and that, and so they were all in a hurry, and they all happened to be doing the same thing because the conferences that they went to and sort of the shared stuff that they were looking at that point there was sort of a leading, Scott was saying maybe there was sort of a leading hypothesis about what the best thing to do would be, and they were all hurrying, so they all just sort of followed the leading hypothesis, maybe. I don't know if Scott was saying that was the case, or if he was saying that might be the case, but in any case, he presented it as they might have all just been following the same leading hypothesis, and maybe there was no coordination, maybe there was no malpractice, or, whatever. It might have just been that they were all on the same wavelength to begin with, or a similar one, and so they all ended up doing a similar thing. Partly also, as Scott was saying, maybe because they were all rushing to do something as fast as they could, so they all went down what seemed like a good path to do it. And when I was listening to that, I was like, wow, like Scott, that's a really logical way to look at that. And here's the thing, I'm not convinced that that's not necessarily what happened in the experience of a lot of these people. But when you find yourself listening to someone where part of their deal is talking about persuasion, and like, I think in almost every episode he specifically talks about persuasion methods, and he was rating like various politicians by how persuasive they were and stuff like that. When this person is talking about persuasion, and they say that they're a trained hypnotist, and they have a very like sort of relaxing presentation, and they joke around, and they're a pretty smart person, like, and they themselves, this person has himself talked about how there's a group of people behind the scenes. Scott talked about this maybe a year and a half ago, maybe more like 2.5 years ago. He was talking about I think it was after I got out of jail that I had heard him say stuff. That he's like, well, I got to tell you, there's a group of people behind the scenes, and they're really pushing for some change here. And he was presenting it as like there's sort of a group of maybe kind of renegade figures behind the scenes that are trying to push the media back into more of a sane way of being. But in any case, all of these things come together, and then you start to feel yourself being like pulled back into an undercurrent of, well, maybe this medical stuff is on the level, and it's like, oh my God, okay, and you're being pulled back into like thinking about politics and like, well, I really would like this person, and it's like, okay, all right, so it's like I'm just gonna slow down here a bit and realize that this might be what I had referred to that day in a little recording as a danger zone or the danger zone. Like, don't, if you think like, oh, I'm a truther, I've looked into truth stuff now, and I've seen past all this BS, and so I'd like to listen to Scott Adams because he's entertaining and he says some cool stuff, and he says some like interesting spiritual stuff and persuasion stuff, and he talks about like sort of empowerment kind of methodology and stuff like that. It can be kind of arrogant. It can be kind of arrogant, I would say, to keep listening to someone like that. And it can be kind of dangerous to keep listening to someone like that because they may be a pretty good persuader, just like they say they are, and they may be like sort of slowly pulling you back in, or at least the effect of listening to them might be to sort of slowly pull you back in. Now, on the other side, there's someone like David Icke where he might be pulling, as Matt McKinley might say, he might be pulling you into some kind of like, sort of fear-based mindset, or he might be pulling you into some kind of like angry frame of reference and some kind of like not buying into the politics and stuff and all that stuff, and indeed actually more of a helpful one because he's kind of giving you hints about like, hey, don't go along with this, like, hey, look out for that, like, hey, this is kind of BS. He's pointing these things out, but he still might be pulling you into a frame he might be undercurrenting you along, is what I'm saying, into something that is just sort of going to be like you spinning your wheels angrily. However, well, here's the thing. I think I've set up without necessarily intending it, but to do it here. But I think I set up sort of a good frame of reference here for saying reading can be helpful. I've had some really big aha moments with a lot of books. I've had aha moments with other people too. Scott Adams particularly, seeing through some of the BS of the politics, some of the BS that's been perpetrated on the left-hand side, the left-hand path. But, I've had aha moments with Matt McKinley, with Zachary K. Hubbard talking about the gematria stuff. I've had aha moments all over the place that haven't been through reading, but many of them have been with reading books as well. And so I will say that books, it's an exercise in concentration. That's helpful in itself. It's an exercise in imagery and visualization and imagination, particularly with fiction books. And it's also sort of an exercise in identifying with characters, and, those characters might help you feel empowered. Like if you're reading a Jack Reacher book, you're probably going to walk around like sort of being very observant and being pretty stoic and being kind of like strategic and being, just like Jack Reacher, I think, is a great series with a good character to, help you feel inspired and help you live in an effective way. A book like The Stranger as well helps break through some of the conditioning of like really caring about what's going on in the relative world and stuff. But here's the thing. See, books can be very helpful, but you're also sort of spending a lot of time with someone's perspective. And as I was talking about with Scott Adams, someone's perspective, knowingly or not, might have some kind of trap doors for you in it. It is, though, I would say, it's very helpful to read, though, and I am interested in reading more. I will say one thing about reading is that a lot of people in prison read, and that's partly, I think, because reading is one of the main sources of entertainment in prison. But, you might want to look at who's doing what, and if prisoners tend to read, that's suspect, as Matt McKinley, it might be heard, as Matt McKinley, would say, you suspect. It's like, okay, well, you don't want to be like a prisoner. Like, prisoners are generally not great people, from what I've seen. As you might suspect, but nevertheless, you're not going to find a lot of really exemplary people in prison. You will find some people who are actually surprisingly, perhaps by contrast, or just in general, you will find some smart and interesting people in prison. I don't recommend going there, but, the fact that a lot of people in prison tend to read, well, here's the thing, though. A lot of the ones who do read tend to be the higher level people there. Like, a lot of the shittier people in jail are the ones who aren't reading. Really, I think probably, like, most of the worst 10 people that I knew in there, like, I didn't see read. And most of the better ones did seem to be readers. Or at least maybe more likely to read. And so that's something. But, yeah, it's just, I've had some really big aha moments with books. Whether it be The Power of Now, huge aha moment. Power of Now, helped break through a lot of my conditioning, by Eckhart Tolle. Super great book. If I had one spiritual book to recommend to people who haven't looked into that stuff, The Power of Now is a great one. And it's super easy, it's fairly short, but it's very powerful. Another one is The Presence Process. Super helpful. It helped me a lot. A lot of great stuff to say about how BS are cultural ideas and cultural narratives about prescription drugs and addiction and stuff like that are. Essentially, a lot of it comes down to, emotional baggage, but a lot of doctors and stuff present it as not being related to emotions, or maybe being related to emotions, but sort of being tangentially related to emotions, as opposed to having emotions at the root of the problem. And so, the presence process was huge for me for that. I think I might have already been maybe a little more skeptical than some about that, but after the presence process, I wasn't interested in pursuing, like, drugs to help cure me of anything. Like, I remember sending an email in college, like, hey, it seems like I have social anxiety, so-called. Could I talk to this, like, college medical person to see about getting, like, medication for social anxiety? And I don't know if I would have said, like, well, this is like a solution, but I was ready to take a crutch anyway. And after, like, The Power of Now and some of the spirituality stuff, and particularly, I think, The Presence Process, a revised edition by Michael Brown, it was like I just wasn't interested in that BS. I wasn't interested in those Band-Aids. So that was a big one. Huge one. Huge help. Just a life-changing book. Another book would be The Wu-Tang Manual by the RZA. really big book for me in terms of looking into like other ideas. It was sort of like a kind of a college experience kind of book where he talks about comparative religion. He talks about sort of kind of business to some extent. He talks about art, like, you know, the idea of like different rappers bringing different things to a rap group, and like it's a lot of the stuff that you'd probably groan about, like, oh, you know, oh, the art of graffiti, or like, oh, the high art of, I don't know if he presents it as high art, but like, oh, you know, rap music and like all this, oh, look at how intellectual these rap guys are. They're playing chess. Oh, look at how cool these guys are. And it's like, you know, if I had read it today for the first time, I might be like, oh yeah, RZA, of course you're talking about all this stuff in lofty terms. It's, you know, there's so much bullshit in it. But I read it at a good time, like towards the latter part of high school, where it was like, oh wow, like this was really inspiring for me. And it was, you know, I'd say it's probably one of the biggest inspirational books I've ever read. Another one, huge one, was The Game by Neil Strauss. The Game, Penetrating the Secret Society of Pickup Artists. Incredible breakthrough moment for me. Particularly, there was this chapter later in the book, after he's learned all these things about how to pick up women and how to like have sex with all these women and just like basically like have sex with any woman you want, and just like, you know, following these scripts, but also just sort of learning how to do it, learning how these things work for yourself, where it becomes second nature. You develop, I think he referred to it as inner game, and pickup artists might refer to it as that. And it's just like, yeah, very powerful stuff. But then he has this chapter later in the book where he talks about all these women that, like, woman after woman after woman after woman that he had sex with. And he's like, I realized that this wasn't particularly impressive. This wasn't a particularly big achievement. It was just so empty. And, you know, if you just hear me say that, or, you know, if someone just said that, it might be like, oh, yeah, you know, like it doesn't really affect you that much. But after reading the book and then getting to that point and reading that chapter, it was like, oh my goodness, like I was reading the book to be like, oh, how do I have sex with like women, and like how do I attract women, and like how am I gonna, you know, like have all these conquests and stuff. And when I got to that point, it was like, it was perfect. It was like, oh, well, I don't feel the need to do this stuff anymore because it's just empty. And I think I even started to realize that it not only was it empty, but it was actually morally destructive for you and for the women that you're taking advantage of, like me. So that was huge, and I don't know if a movie or some kind of podcast or series of podcasts even, or like even an audiobook, listening to that book in audio, I don't know if another format would have led me to such a powerful realization. But it really was sort of the cliche of like, if you read books, you can have the experiences that other people have had without going through the motions yourself. And it's like, that book was a really great inoculation to the whole concept of pickup artistry and of like being a womanizer and stuff, because it is what it is. You know, I didn't see it as being a womanizer, but after reading the book, it was like, oh shit, you know, I think it still took a while to set in. In fact, I remember one of my friends in college saying he was worried that he was becoming a womanizer, and he wasn't. But if he stayed on the path that he was on, then I guess he might have become one. He really wasn't. I mean, I guess, to be fair, he kind of was a womanizer, but for our social standards, he was not a womanizer at all. But, you know, in the sense that you're a womanizer if you, like, have sex with a woman without intending a family, which I would say is a womanizing thing to do, you know, he was a bit of a womanizer, just like I've been a bit of a womanizer. But, you know, in the context of what other people are doing, it's just like nothing. And in the context of what other people are doing, my womanizing has been just like nothing. But it still is something. But like, I remember hearing him say that, and I think this was like maybe more than a year after I had finished the game, maybe not, but and I had like just really callous response. I was still kind of angry at women, kind of angry at the whole culture, kind of like an incel kind of point of view, not like the ooh scary, but sort of like the more like someone who would call themselves an incel, like just like, oh, I'd like to have sex with these women, and like it's like, oh, women control the sex, and like, oh, you know, why don't they have sex with me? And of course, I myself wasn't like going out and putting the effort in. If I had been, I think I would have had a lot more so-called conquests. I'm glad I didn't, actually, because I probably would have turned into a fucking womanizer, more than I had been. But, you know, I responded to my friend saying, like, I'm worried that I'm becoming a womanizer. I responded to him saying, like, oh, it's just all pelts on the wall or something. And I said it really cynically, and I said it very, like, disrespectfully to the women that he was afraid that he was using, and to whatever extent he was taking part in that, he was using them. But, you know, but as Sam Harris says, like, in today's society, you kind of have to be a moral hero to not be sort of going along with perverted incentives. And Sam Harris, I think, is in many ways a terrible, fucking asshole, evil person. But he has a good point there. Like, one is kind of a moral hero to not be a moral degenerate these days. And so, like, basically, a lot of the conditioning is just leading you to, like, using women like meat, or if you're a woman, to being used like meat, and, you know, just all these horrible things. And, you know, if you're not extraordinary morally, then you're gonna probably be pulled down some, like, really morally evil, not even questionable, but morally evil paths these days. And one of the things that really helped me with some of this is The Game by Neil Strauss. Even though it took a lot more spiritual work, and it took a lot more even looking into truther stuff and looking into various things for me to really, for everything to really kind of settle, or at least for more of it to kind of settle into my more current understanding.
Hostile care package deployed. Let's strafe in your area. Hostiles are strafing us!
Recon sweeping us.
Got an enemy glide bomb on the way.
Tossing grenade! Incoming grenade!
Recon plate scanning the area.
Incoming grenade!
Allies called a bombing run. Incoming. Bleeding embarrassment, this is. Enemy care package inbound. Watch for an enemy guard.
Get down!
He'll sure muck that up.